My name is Daniel Whitfield, and 3 years ago I moved into a quiet neighborhood called Maple Ridge Estates, looking for nothing more than a peaceful place to raise my daughter and finally settle down after 20 years of grinding through law school, a public defender salary, and a decade as a county prosecutor. I had just been appointed to fill a vacated seat as a county judge, a position I hadn't even announced publicly yet, since my swearing-in ceremony was still 6 weeks away. I wanted to move in quietly, unpack in peace, and become just another face on a cul-de-sac. What I didn't expect was that my new neighborhood had its own miniature government, complete with its own miniature tyrant, and her name was Deborah Lang. Deborah was the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, a role she had apparently held for 11 consecutive years, uncontested, because, as I would later learn, nobody else wanted to deal with the sheer volume of paperwork, meetings, and confrontation that came with opposing her. She was in her early 60s, always dressed like she was on her way to inspect a 5-star hotel, and she carried a clipboard the way some people carry a badge. She had appointed herself judge, jury, and enforcer of 31 pages of community bylaws that she had personally rewritten 4 times over the past decade, each revision adding more restrictions and, conveniently, more power to her own office. I met her on my second day in the neighborhood. I was still hauling boxes out of my pickup truck, a matte gray, 3/4-ton work truck I use for hauling firewood, moving furniture, and hitching up my daughter's old horse trailer on weekends, when Deborah appeared on my driveway like she had been standing behind a hedge waiting for the right moment. "You must be the new owner," she said, not extending a hand, but extending her clipboard instead, as if it were a formality I needed to sign before I was allowed to speak. "I'm Deborah Lang, HOA President. I just wanted to let you know, dear, that we have some very specific parking guidelines here at Maple Ridge." I smiled, still holding a box labeled kitchen, fragile, and told her I appreciated the heads up and that I'd read through the bylaws that weekend. "You'll want to move that truck," she said, gesturing toward my driveway with the confidence of someone pointing out a crime scene. "Trucks over a certain size aren't permitted in driveways overnight. It's Section 4, subsection C." I glanced at my truck, then back at her. "It's parked in my own driveway." "Doesn't matter," she said. "The bylaws apply to all common view areas, and a driveway is visible from the street, so it falls under the aesthetic guidelines." I didn't argue. I had just moved in, I didn't want conflict with my new neighbors, and frankly, I had bigger things on my mind, namely, unpacking an entire house by myself while my 10-year-old daughter, Mia, ran around asking which room was going to be hers. So I thanked Deborah for the information, and I told her I'd take care of it. I moved the truck to the garage that evening, mostly to avoid a headache, not because I agreed with her interpretation of the rules. For the next few weeks, things were quiet. I met a few other neighbors, a retired teacher named Carol who baked banana bread for anyone who so much as glanced at her porch, and a younger couple, the Ramirezes, who had 2 kids close to MIA's age. Life started to feel normal. I was getting ready for my swearing in, spending my evenings reviewing case files that would soon be assigned to my docket, and trying to keep a low profile until the ceremony. I hadn't told anyone in the neighborhood about my new position. It simply hadn't come up, and honestly, I like the anonymity. For the first time in years, nobody looked at me and saw the prosecutor or the judge. They just saw a guy unloading a truck. The first tow happened on a Saturday morning in early spring. I had pulled my truck into the driveway the night before because I needed to load up mulch and topsoil early for a landscaping project in the backyard, and my garage was already packed with a horse trailer and a stack of moving boxes I hadn't gotten around to unpacking. I figured one night in the driveway wouldn't be a problem. I was wrong. At around 7 in the morning, I walked outside with my coffee to find my driveway empty. Not empty like I had imagined it, empty like my truck had vanished into thin air. For a moment, I genuinely thought it had been stolen. My heart dropped. I called the police to report it, and it was only after the dispatcher asked me to check for any towing notices that I noticed a small yellow sticker stuck to my mailbox post. It read, "Vehicle towed per HOA bylaw section 4C. Contact Maple Ridge HOA office for release information." I stood there in my driveway in my socks, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at that sticker for a solid minute before I even processed what had happened. My truck, the truck I used to haul my daughter's things, the truck that had nothing wrong with it, parked legally in my own private driveway, had been towed overnight without a single phone call, a single knock on my door, or a single warning beyond a conversation I'd had weeks earlier that I genuinely believe had been resolved. I called the HOA office. Deborah answered. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, in a tone that somehow managed to sound both cheerful and condescending at once. I did send several notices about the parking guidelines. I'm sure you understand we have to enforce the rules consistently for everyone. I moved the truck into the garage weeks ago, I said, trying to keep my voice level. It was in the driveway for one night because I had a landscaping delivery. Well, the bylaws don't make exceptions for landscaping deliveries, she said. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but rules are rules. I asked her, calmly, whether there was a formal notification process before a tow, a warning, a sticker on the vehicle itself, anything, because in most jurisdictions, private property towing without prior notice is heavily regulated, sometimes requiring signage, a grace period, or direct communication with the property owner. She told me the HOA had discretion under the bylaws to tow immediately for repeat violations, and reminded me, again, that I had been informed once before. I picked up my truck from the impound lot that afternoon. It cost me $280, plus an hour and a half of my Saturday. I didn't make a scene. I paid the fee, thanked the tow yard attendant, who seemed genuinely apologetic on Deborah's behalf, and drove home thinking that surely this had been a one-time overreaction, a misunderstanding that wouldn't happen again. I was wrong about that too. The second tow happened about 5 weeks later, just 10 days before my swearing-in ceremony. This time, I hadn't even left my truck in the driveway overnight. I had parked it there for maybe 45 minutes while I ran inside to grab my daughter's soccer bag before we headed to her Saturday morning game. 45 minutes. I came back outside, gear in hand, ready to load up and go, and found the driveway empty again. Another yellow sticker on the mailbox. Mia looked up at me, confused, asking why our truck kept disappearing. I told her not to worry about it, that grown-up rules were sometimes silly, and that would take the sedan to her game instead. But inside, something in me shifted. This wasn't about a truck anymore. This was about a woman who had appointed herself the sole interpreter and enforcer of a rulebook, who used that self-appointed authority to make snap judgments about people's property without any real process, and who seemed to take a strange satisfaction in exercising that power. I had spent my entire career studying due process, the idea that before the government, or any authority, takes something from you, you deserve notice and a chance to be heard. Deborah Lang had violated that principle twice in 5 weeks, and she had done it to a family that had done nothing wrong except park in their own driveway. I called the HOA office again. This time, Deborah wasn't as chipper. Mr. Whitfield, I understand you're frustrated, but this is the second violation. The bylaws allow for immediate towing on repeat offences. It was parked for 45 minutes while I grabbed my daughter's soccer bag, I said. The rules don't specify a minimum time, she replied. A violation is a violation. I asked to see the specific bylaw language in writing, along with the HOA's official towing policy and any documentation showing that residents had been properly notified of enforcement procedures, including whether the HOA board had ever voted to approve the current towing practices, since, as a matter of general community association law, towing policies typically need to be adopted through a formal board resolution and communicated to residents through, at minimum, written notice, not simply announced verbally on someone's second day in the neighborhood. Deborah's tone changed slightly. I don't see why that's necessary. I've been running this HOA for 11 years, and I know how to handle these situations. I'd still like to see the documentation, I said. I'll have to get back to you, she said, and hung up. I picked up my truck for the second time, paid another $280, and drove home. On the way, I stopped by my sister's place to pick up MIA's old cleats, and I mentioned what had happened. My sister, who has never been shy about giving her opinion, laughed so hard she nearly dropped her coffee mug. You do realize, she said, that in 6 weeks you're going to be sitting behind a bench listening to people argue about exactly this kind of thing. Notice requirements, due process, property rights. And meanwhile you can't even keep your own truck in your own driveway for 45 minutes. It's not funny, I said, though I was smiling despite myself. It's a little funny, she said. But seriously, Dan, you should look into what she's actually allowed to do. Because from what you're describing, that doesn't sound legal, HOA or not. She wasn't wrong, and she wasn't the only one who said something along those lines. My court clerk, a sharp young woman named Priya who I'd worked with during my final months as a prosecutor and who had transferred over to help me set up my new chambers, overheard me venting about it during a lunch break the following Monday. She raised an eyebrow and said, You know most state HOA statutes require specific towing notice procedures, right? It's not just a courtesy thing. Some states even have it written directly into the vehicle code, not just HOA governing documents. If she's skipping notice altogether, that's not just a bylaw violation, that could be a statutory one too. I told her I appreciated the tip, but that I wanted to handle it the right way first, through the HOA's own internal process, before considering anything more formal. Priya shrugged and said that sounded exactly like something a judge would say, which made us both laugh. That evening, after Mia had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out my laptop. I wasn't angry in the way that makes a person act rashly. Years on the bench, even before I formally took my seat, had taught me to slow down and gather facts before drawing conclusions. But I was determined to understand exactly what authority Deborah Lang believed she had, and whether that authority actually existed anywhere outside of her own head. I requested, in writing, a copy of the full HOA governing documents, the meeting minutes from the past 2 years, and any board resolutions related to towing enforcement. Under most state HOA transparency laws, associations are required to provide these records to homeowners within a reasonable time frame. It took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up letters, but eventually, a manila envelope showed up in my mailbox. What I found inside was revealing. The bylaws did mention vehicle restrictions, but the language was vague, referring to oversized commercial vehicles and vehicles causing aesthetic disruption to the community, with no clear definition of size or duration. There was no board resolution authorizing immediate towing for a first or even second offense. In fact, the official enforcement procedure outlined in the bylaws required a written warning, a 10-day cure period, and a vote by the full board before any vehicle could be towed from private property, even common view areas. None of that had happened. Deborah had been operating entirely on her own authority, making unilateral towing decisions for years, and apparently nobody had ever formally challenged her on it. I also learned something else. In the meeting minutes, buried in the notes from a board session 18 months earlier, a homeowner named Mr. Ashworth had raised a nearly identical complaint about being towed without notice. The minutes noted that Deborah had responded to the board that she handles these matters personally to keep the process efficient, and the board, 3 retirees and a part-time volunteer, had simply moved on to the next agenda item without further discussion. Efficient, apparently, meant skipping due process entirely. 10 days later, I was sworn in as a county judge in a small ceremony at the courthouse, surrounded by my daughter, a handful of colleagues, and my elderly mother, who cried through most of it. It wasn't a secret anymore. The local paper ran a short article the following week with my photo and a brief bio, mentioning my background as a prosecutor and my new role overseeing civil and small claims matters for the county. I didn't think much of it at the time. I certainly didn't think about Deborah Lang or her clipboard. But apparently, several of my neighbors did. About 2 weeks after the article ran, I was walking Mia to the bus stop when Carol, my banana bread neighbor, stopped me with wide eyes. "Daniel, is that you in the paper? The new judge?" I laughed, a little embarrassed. "That's me, yes." "Oh, you have to tell Deborah," Carol said, grinning like she already knew exactly what was going to happen. "She's been telling everyone for weeks that she's thinking about towing Mr. Ashworth's boat trailer next, and that she doesn't care what anyone says because nobody's going to take her to court over a parking rule." I told Carol I had no plans to make a scene about it, that it wasn't really my style to use my position to settle personal disputes, and that I intended to let the HOA process play out the way it was supposed to. But word travels fast in small neighborhoods, and within a few days, it seemed like everyone on Maple Ridge Court knew that the quiet guy with the gray truck was now a sitting county judge. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I never once used my judicial position to threaten Deborah, intimidate her, or pressure the HOA board into anything. That would have been a serious ethical violation, the kind of thing that could get a judge removed from the bench, and frankly, it goes against everything I believe about the proper use of authority. What I did instead was exactly what any homeowner is entitled to do. I filed a formal written complaint with the HOA board, citing the specific bylaw provisions that had been violated, requesting reimbursement for both towing fees, and asking the board to review Deborah's enforcement practices going forward. I sent a copy to every board member, individually, by certified mail, along with the documentation I had gathered. The board meeting where this was discussed happened to be open to all residents, and I decided to attend, not as a judge, but simply as a homeowner exercising his right to speak at a public HOA meeting, the same right every one of my neighbors had. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a modest room with folding chairs and a coffee urn that had clearly seen better decades. About 20 residents showed up, more than usual, which Carol later told me was because word had spread about the complaint. Deborah sat at the front table alongside the 4 other board members, her clipboard resting in front of her like a shield. When it came time to address my complaint, the board treasurer, a soft-spoken man named Harold, read the letter aloud to the room. I watched Deborah's expression shift as each bylaw citation was read, the notice requirement, the 10-day cure period, the mandatory board vote, each one a rule she had personally skipped, twice, in my case, and apparently many times before with other residents. When Harold finished, Deborah tried to defend herself. "I've been enforcing these rules for 11 years without a single formal complaint," she said. "I don't understand why this is suddenly such an issue." Mr. Ashworth, sitting a few rows behind me, raised his hand. "It's not sudden, Deborah. I complained about the same thing 18 months ago. You told the board you'd handle it personally, and then nothing changed." A murmur went through the room. Another resident, a woman I hadn't met yet, mentioned she had been towed the previous summer for parking a work van in her driveway for 2 hours while she unloaded groceries after a long shift, and had never received a written warning either. I didn't say much during the meeting. I let the documentation speak for itself, and I let my neighbors speak for themselves. When it was my turn, I simply stated the facts calmly, that I had been towed twice without proper notice, that the bylaws required a specific process that hadn't been followed, and that I believed the board owed it to every resident to ensure the rules were applied fairly and consistently, with real accountability, not based on one person's personal discretion. The board voted that night, 4-1, to require all future towing enforcement to go through the formal written notice and board approval process outlined in the bylaws. They also voted to reimburse me for both towing fees, along with 2 other residents who came forward with similar stories once they realized they weren't alone. Deborah, unsurprisingly, cast the lone dissenting vote. What happened next wasn't dramatic or vindictive. It was simply accountability catching up with someone who had avoided it for over a decade. 2 months later, at the HOA's annual election, Deborah ran for re-election as president, as she had unopposed for 11 straight years. This time, Harold ran against her, along with the surprise nomination of Mr. Ashworth as secretary. The community, now aware of just how much unchecked authority had been concentrated in one person's hands, turned out in numbers nobody had seen before at an HOA election. Deborah lost, decisively, receiving less than a quarter of the vote. I saw her a few weeks after the election, out walking her small terrier past my house. I nodded politely, the way you do with a neighbor, regardless of history. She stopped, looked at me for a long moment, and said, somewhat stiffly, "I suppose congratulations are in order. On the judgeship, I mean." "Thank you," I said. "I want you to know," she continued, "that I always believed I was doing what was best for the neighborhood. Keeping standards up. Keeping things orderly." I thought about that for a moment before responding, because I genuinely believe most people who abuse a little bit of power don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as guardians of order, even when the way they enforce that order tramples over the basic fairness that everyone else is entitled to. "I understand that," I told her. "But even good intentions need to follow a fair process. That's really all this was ever about." She didn't say much after that. She gave a small nod and continued on her walk. Life on Maple Ridge Court has been quieter since then, in the best possible way. The new HOA board, under Harold's leadership, adopted a formal written notice system, complete with a mandatory 48-hour warning period before any vehicle can be towed, along with photographic documentation and a simple appeals process for residents who believe they've been unfairly cited. Nobody's truck disappears overnight anymore without at least a conversation first. Mia still asks, every now and then, half joking, whether our truck is going to go missing again, and I always tell her the same thing: rules matter, but so does treating people fairly when you enforce them, and that's true whether you're running a courtroom or a homeowners association. Looking back, I don't think Deborah Lang ever set out to be a villain in anyone's story. I think she was simply a person who had been given a small amount of authority, had never been meaningfully challenged on how she used it, and had slowly convinced herself that her personal judgment was the same thing as the rule of law. It's a mistake I've seen in far more serious contexts throughout my career: the quiet, gradual slide from enforcing rules to simply enforcing your own preferences, dressed up as rules. The truck was never really the point. The point was whether people in small positions of power remember that authority, even the smallest kind, exists to serve fairness, not the other way around. These days, when new families move into Maple Ridge Estates, Harold makes it a point to personally welcome them, hand them a clearly written copy of the parking guidelines, and remind them that if they ever have a dispute, there's a real process in place, one with notice, one with a chance to be heard, and one where nobody gets to make unilateral decisions about somebody else's property based on a clipboard and a bad mood. It's a small neighborhood, and it was always a small dispute in the grand scheme of things. But sometimes the smallest disputes teach the clearest lessons about why fairness, process, and accountability matter, not just in courtrooms, but on quiet driveways too. A few months after everything settled down, I found myself telling this story to a group of new judges during an orientation session I'd been asked to help lead. I hadn't planned on bringing it up. The agenda was supposed to cover courtroom procedure and case management, nothing nearly as mundane as an HOA parking dispute. But one of the newer judges asked a question about how to think about proportionality when reviewing disputes between individuals and small governing bodies, homeowners associations, condo boards, that sort of thing, and I realized I actually had a pretty good example sitting right in my own driveway, twice. I told them the short version. No truck jokes, no dramatics, just the bones of it. A woman with good intentions and 11 years of unchecked authority. A rulebook that existed on paper but was never actually followed. A community that had simply gotten used to one person making all the decisions, because nobody had ever stopped to ask whether that person was actually following the rules she claimed to be enforcing. The lesson isn't really about towing, I told them. It's that power, even small power, tends to expand to fill whatever space nobody's watching. Somebody has to watch. Sometimes that somebody is a judge. But most of the time, it's just a neighbor willing to ask the right questions and keep a paper trail. Mia is 12 now, and she still brings it up sometimes, usually when we are pulling into the driveway after one of her games. Think it's safe to leave the truck out tonight? She'll ask, grinning, and I always tell her the same thing, that it's safe now, because somebody finally read the fine print. She rolls her eyes at that every time, the way 12-year-olds do at their dads, but I catch her smiling anyway. As for Deborah, I understand she's still active in the neighborhood in smaller ways. She volunteers with the Community Garden Committee now, which by all accounts she runs with the same meticulous energy she once brought to parking enforcement, except this time nobody seems to mind, because tomatoes and zucchini don't really need due process. Every so often I see her out walking her dog, and we exchange a polite wave, two neighbors who learned, in our own very different ways, that rules only mean something when they apply to everyone equally, including the person holding the clipboard. And my truck? It still sits in the driveway most nights, right where it belongs, no yellow stickers in sight.